God said to Abram, "I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing to the nations." Wait, what? So God is going to bless Abram, who later changes his name to Abraham. God is going to bless Abram if Abram leaves his home and takes a potentially very dangerous journey to somewhere in Canaan. And God will make of Abram a great nation, and then God will at some point bless Abram, whatever that means. That's really quite vague, isn't it? I mean, where exactly were they going? What if there were bandits along the way? Will there be a battle? And doesn't God know that Sarai, Abram's wife, is barren? She can't have kids. And what exactly are God's blessings? God doesn't say. Dunno, blessings sound great, right? But Abram doesn't even know exactly what his blessings will be at the beginning of his journey. Are the blessings really worth leaving your home for, Abram? Anyway, Abram decides, without really having a clue what he's in for, to trust God and set out on this foolhardy journey. At least that's how it would seem to those around, right? Foolhardy. Trusting in God when you don't know really if God will pull through and how God will pull through, and taking your family to boot into this potentially very dangerous journey doesn't seem too wise, does it? Mind you, Terah, who was Abram's father, took Abram and Sarai, as well as Terah's son Haran's son Lot, so Terah's grandson, and they set out to go to Canaan. But instead of traveling all the way to Canaan, they settled in a place called Haran, and Terah died there. So Abram was really continuing the journey to Canaan that his father had begun. We don't know why Abram's father left in the first place, but we do know that he was a descendant of Shem, who was a son of Noah. And Noah trusted God enough to seem really foolhardy to the world around when he built a great big boat when there was no water around in great quantities. Well, eventually, of course, that turned out well for Noah, didn't it? Yeah. Okay, so we can assume that a strong faith in God was passed down through the generations to Abram's father and then to Abram himself. Why can we assume this? Well, if you had known nothing, absolutely nothing about God at all, and all of a sudden you heard a voice from God telling you to take a long, quite possibly very dangerous trip and promising descendants that weren't possible and vague blessings, you simply wouldn't do it, right? So, Abram must have already had the sort of relationship with God where he talked with God and obeyed God. Abram must have already had the sort of relationship with God where he knew God was trustworthy, that God kept God's promises. Abram must have already had a relatively solid faith in God, because only a deep trust in God would allow him to risk everything to go on a journey God had set before him. Now, when Abram says yes to God, by going on the journey that God has set before him, and no to a stable life, God is now obligated to carry through with God's promise to be committed to Abram, just as Abram is committed to God in his future. They are partners in life, in a sense. God has created a new family with Abram and his family. In this new family, the new identity of Abram and Sarai in the family is to be the people who listen to God and obey God. God's role in this new family is to fulfill God's promises to bless Abram and Sarai. And with this new identity in this new family, we know that Abram and Sarai will come closer to God as they choose to say yes to God and no to the things that would take them away from God. Their lives will gain a whole new level of meaning as they live out their values to trust God and obey God, for that's what happens when a people follows God. True followers of God have a different added dimension to life that makes following God really worthwhile. What blessings might Abram expect from God, given their culture? Well, if we include a quick read of possible blessings from Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 3 to 15, we find blessings such as one's work being prosperous, God's protection, and having children. Also, lots of spiritual blessings come from following God, of course, like peace, joy, patience, hope, and so on. God's blessings are gifts. And in the Bible, God's blessing belongs to the whole sphere of creation. I mean, if we look back to Genesis, where God created the earth and all that is in the earth, it is made clear that God's blessings are part of God's purpose for the world, not only for humans, but also for other living things. Also, blessings from God were included in God's promises to Adam and Eve, both before and after their sin. You might say that you don't have to believe in God to receive God's blessings, right? For instance, the blessing of rain can fall not only on Abram's family, but also other people around Abram who don't follow God. This is true. However, the point is clear in the Bible that blessings are stronger and more abundant in the lives of those who hear God and obey God. And I'd like to point out that you don't necessarily get the blessings you ask for when you follow God. I mean, you could ask God for lots of money, for instance, and God could look at you and say, I see that if you were to get way more money, that you would fall away from me. So of course God wouldn't give you that blessing. Or remember Paul, who kept asking God to take away the thorn in his flesh? God said, no. We don't know what Paul's thorn in the flesh was, and we don't know why it wasn't taken away, but the point is that God is not a genie God who grants us all our wishes just because we listen to God and obey God. God gives us the blessings in our lives that will help us to enjoy the life God has given us on physical, mental, and spiritual planes. God also gives us blessings so that we learn to live our lives on a spiritual plane as well as the physical plane. For the spiritual plane of existence can seem rather intangible, can't it? Many people don't see it or hear it or feel it on a regular basis. It's super easy to live as if the spiritual plane does not exist. It's super easy to get so caught up in the physical and mental parts of life that we completely turn our back on the spiritual parts of our lives. But the spiritual breaks in here and there because our very natures have a spiritual side, and it just can't be helped. And the more we turn to God, the more we find the spiritual stuff breaking into our lives because, well, we're more open to being able to receive God's input in our lives. It's all a sort of journey, right? Life has an outward journey that includes things such as our job, looking after our house, being with our family and friends, pursuing our hobbies, taking part in our church work, etc., etc. And life has an inward spiritual journey as well that goes on at the very same time. Our choices in the physical plane affects our souls. For when we say yes to doing God's work on the physical plane, we open up our souls more fully to God. When we say no to doing God's work in this physical plane, we block God from part of our soul. You know, Abram's outward journey of heading off to Canaan was also an inward journey of coming closer to God. He didn't always trust God along the way and got into a bit of hot water here and there, but God helped him anyway. And Abram always turned back to God. As a result, he came even closer to God. He found with his deeper relationship with God, who had proven time and again to act in Abram's life that he could trust God more fully, and then since he was more open to God, he was more open to receiving even more of God's blessings. At least that's how we know how it works. God's promise to Abram that God will bless Abram if Abram follows God becomes our promise too when we follow God. Jesus made that clear. God promises each of you listening that you will be blessed with God's blessings if you try to follow God. God doesn't wait till you perfectly follow God, because no one living on earth has ever perfectly followed God except Jesus. Failure is part of the learning process for all of us. All God asks of us is that we try to follow God. You know, we try with our minds, we try with our hearts, we try with our souls, we try with our strength. We try to listen to God and obey God. Okay, God is absolutely delighted when we do this because God loves us so very much. Just had to add that. Anyway, when we try to listen to God and obey God, we are doing our part in the relationship with God, and God does God's part. We become partners with God. We receive God's blessings. And then because we are blessed, we pass on our blessings to those around us. And then others can come to know our wonderful God too. I mean, when God talked with Abram before Abram set out for Canaan, God pointed out that part of being blessed by God is that Abram and Sarai and their family will be blessings to those around them. God didn't say you have to be blessings, but that you will be blessings. The thing about blessings is that we have a choice. We can choose to pass on the blessings or not. But keep in mind that it's as we choose to pass on the blessings that we receive from God that God can keep on giving us blessings. We can imagine this as a flow of water. God's presence and blessings flow into us, and if we are passing on God's love and blessings, they also flow out of us. There's a constant stream of God's love and life flowing into us and then out of us, to our friends, to our family, to our neighbors, to the world. If we stop passing God's love and blessings, we dam up the flow, and God has a harder time working through us. We don't follow God in order to receive God's blessings, right? Because that becomes self-serving. And anyway, chances are good that we don't even know which blessings are best at which points in our lives. So we might as well leave the choosing of whatever blessings we receive up to God and leave it all to God. We don't pass on blessings in order to seem good in the eyes of the world either, right? Because then we risk becoming pretty full of ourselves. Like, wow, I'm so good. I passed on blessings of God to people around me. No, you are simply passing on the blessings that God first gave to you. So, in short, you who follow God, at whatever stage you are in your journey with God, you are called to pass on God's blessings out of the blessings that God has given to you. And when you do this, you are in partnership with God. You are part of God's family, and God can do new things in your life, good things, wonderful things. So this week, I'm inviting you to go into blessing stealth mode. Admittedly, this can be a little bit more challenging because we're in the midst of a pandemic, but it's still quite possible. As I outline what this looks like, know that you who are on my email list or my newsletter mailing list will receive these points that I'm about to say in case you'd like to review them later. So I invite you to, first, pray to God, asking for input into your blessings and what you can pass on. This invites God to be a partner with you in this area, and so the whole exercise can end up being much more meaningful. 2, look at the blessings in your life. If you have the time, really think this through, and some of you might find it helpful to write them down. 3, maybe take some time to think of how it feels to be blessed by others. Think of particular instances when you were blessed in your life. Feels pretty good, doesn't it? 4, decide what you can do to bless someone else what you'd like to do, and feel creative. After all, God is quite creative in giving you your blessings. You could, for instance, if you have monetary resources, go online or write a check to a charity or give your church extra money for the Mission and Service Fund. That's the fund in the United Church of Canada that does so much good around the world. You could phone someone who's on your mind. You could sneak out and shovel snow for someone you know who would appreciate it. If there is someone else in your house, you could unexpectedly make them a coffee or do something else you know that they'd appreciate. There are many, many things you could do to bless others. And by the way, this passing on of blessings is a Lenten practice. If you choose to go into blessing stealth mode this week, or longer, you decide how many times you'd like to bless others. And go out and have some fun. Let's pray. God, it's often fun to bless others, to pass on our blessings to them. It must be really wonderful for you, too, to pass blessings on to us. Help us to be partners with you so that together we can bless the world and heal the world with your love and care and make the world a better place. Thanks. Amen.